There are deaths that crash into history like thunder, and then there are deaths that slip in like a blade sliding between ribs. Marie Antoinette's death did both. On the grey noon of October 16th, in the year 1793, the guillotine didn't just fall, it cracked open. The illusion of a revolution that believed it could wash itself clean with blood. As the blade tore downward with a wet, final snap, the crowd roared as if they had just pulled a monster out of the world. But the truth was far stranger, far darker. They didn't kill a demon that day. They killed a woman who had been stripped of everything that once made her human, carved down over 76 days, until only a trembling, breath-thin outline remained. And as her severed head was lifted high like a trophy, Paris cheered without realizing it had just murdered a question that would haunt nations long after the cheers died. How much blood does freedom cost? Her story didn't begin in the darkness of a prison cell. It began in the blinding gold of Versailles. When a 14-year-old Austrian girl named Maria Antonia arrived in France in the year 1770, wearing a wedding gown stitched with treaties instead of thread, she stepped into a palace that felt less like a home and more like a living organism made of gossip, hierarchy, and ritual. More than 3,000 courtiers circled her like predators dressed in silk, measuring her every breath. Versailles trained her not to live but to perform, turning her into a symbol long before she understood the weight of her own name. And when France grew hungry, when pamphlets painted her as a foreign leech, when bread vanished and rage took its place, she became the easiest target, not because she was guilty, but because she was visible. By the time the year 1789 arrived, Paris was boiling. When a mob of furious women stormed Versailles and smashed their way through the gates, Marie felt the old world crack beneath her feet. Every scream outside her window, every thud of fists against the doors, every drop of guards' blood trickling across marble floors told her that the hunger of the people had shifted into something far more dangerous. They didn't want answers. They wanted a throat. And hers would do, from Versailles to the Tuileries, from the Tuileries to the medieval tower of the temple. The royal family fell like a chandelier dropping from its ceiling. The walls grew smaller. The food grew thinner. The guards grew colder. But nothing cut deeper than the morning they tore her son, Louis Charles, from her arms. The boy, only 7, was locked away, broken down, and turned into a puppet who would one day repeat lies. They fed him lies about his mother, lies meant to corrupt the last piece of her heart. When those accusations were read aloud during her trial, Marie didn't scream. She simply whispered the only truth that could escape her lips. Nature refuses to answer such a charge brought against a mother. The entire courtroom felt the floor tilt beneath them, because in that moment they realized they could wound her, starve her, humiliate her, but they could not make her less human. Then came the conciergerie, the final, merciless throat of the revolution. The damp cell walls breathed mold. The straw mattress stank. A guard watched her every hour, every gesture, every sigh. Her hair turned white. Her body thinned into angles. She became something ghostly, but never weak, even stripped of jewels, dress, privacy, and dignity. She held on to a kind of stillness that terrified her captors more than any scream could have. And when the morning of her execution arrived, they cut her hair close to the scalp, dressed her in a plain white chemise, and loaded her onto a crude wooden cart meant for trash. Paris flooded the streets, not to mourn but to feast on the spectacle. Children laughed, vendors sold wine, men shouted insults. Yet she sat straight, bound hands hidden behind her back, her face pale but calm. Witnesses later whispered that she looked less like a prisoner and more like someone who had already died once and returned with nothing left to fear. The cart rattled across the stones for 45 long minutes. A slow parade of cruelty. And when she stepped off at the Place de la Révolution, when she climbed the scaffold and accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, her last words were not a plea, not a curse, but a soft apology. "Pardon me, sire. I did not mean to." A whisper of courtesy in a world soaked with hatred. A human gesture that sliced deeper than any blade. At exactly 12:15, the guillotine dropped. The crowd screamed in triumph as her head fell into the basket. But history stood still, watching the moment when a queen stopped being an icon and became something far more unsettling. A woman whose composure survived even the machine built to erase her. Her story did not end when the blade fell. It began. Because the real horror wasn't her death, but the centuries-long shadow it cast, forcing the world to look again and again at the line between justice and vengeance, at the cost of revolution, at the ease with which a crowd can swallow its own humanity. And in that shadow, Marie Antoinette remains not as the villain they wished she was, but as the question they could never silence. She had once lived in rooms so bright, they seemed carved from daylight itself. Yet the second chapter of her descent unfolded in places where light felt like an intruder. After the blade claimed Louis XVI in the cold morning of January in the year 1793, Marie was no longer a queen in waiting, but a widow drifting through the ruins of a revolution that had already decided her fate, long before anyone announced she would stand trial. The palace walls that had once echoed with chandeliers and violins were replaced with stone that sweated moisture, corridors where footsteps never hurried, and the distant clank of metal that reminded her at every hour she had been reduced to a body in a cage. Yet even as she lived through that erosion of identity, she clung to a quiet internal order, a discipline that seemed almost defiant, as though she believed that if she stayed steady, she could tether herself to one more day, one more breath, one more fragile chance to remember the world before everything collapsed. Her mornings in the temple tower began not with ceremony, but with the scrape of metal sliding against metal when guards unlocked the door to check if she was still alive. She would rise slowly, her bones stiff from cold nights spent on a narrow bed, and move through the room with the same grace she once used in Versailles. Not out of vanity, but because grace had become one of the last things she controlled. She would fold her blanket, smooth the corners, and tuck the cloth as though preparing a guest room that no one would ever enter. That tiny ritual created a sense of shape in a world without structure. Sometimes she would pause by the window where faint light slipped through the bars, touch the cold metal with her fingertips, and imagine the gardens she once walked. The scent of blooming roses drifting across warm air, the feel of the earth beneath her shoes as she wandered without fear. Those memories did not comfort her, but she held them close, because losing them too soon would mean losing the pieces of herself that still felt alive. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, stayed in the same cell for a time, and the girl clung to her mother with a quiet desperation that only deepened Marie's resolve to remain upright. The two of them shared whispered conversations at night, exchanging words that felt more like handshakes across a void, speaking softly so the guards would not accuse them of plotting. Marie brushed her daughter's hair with her fingers instead of a comb, murmuring little stories in French and German to keep her mind from drowning in fear. The girl sometimes asked for her brother in a trembling voice, and Marie would answer with an honesty that still carried hope, even though she no longer believed it herself. She told her daughter that Louis Charles was strong, that he was brave, that he would survive this as they survived together, that they would one day see him again. But the truth scraped her from the inside, because every night she pressed her ear to the wall and listened for a cry she never heard. There were moments when silence fell so heavily in the tower that she could feel her heartbeat louder than footsteps outside the door. That silence frightened her more than the shouting crowds of Paris. because it carried a cold certainty that the world beyond the stone had moved on without her, that she was no longer a person whose life mattered. She learned to read the mood of guards by the way they set down their keys or coughed in the corridor, and she could tell when they carried news even before they spoke. When they finally informed her that her son had accused her of unspeakable crimes, she did not collapse. Instead, she felt a kind of numbness seep through her bones, a numbness so deep, it felt like her heart had turned to stone. She did not shout. She did not deny. She simply sat in silence as the lie settled into the room like dust. And only later, when darkness pressed against the small window, did she lift her hands to her face and allow herself to tremble. Days blurred into each other, marked only by the sound of keys and the serving of coarse bread that tasted of mold. She lost weight quickly, Hirdras's hanging loose, her face taking on the pale, sharp angles of someone who had been carved down to essentials. Yet there were mornings when she still stood at the small cracked mirror the guards sometimes left in the cell, tilting her head slightly, as if looking for the woman she used to be. The one whose image had once been painted across canvases and thrown onto pamphlets both adoring and obscene. She held no illusions. She knew the woman staring back was only a ghost of that figure, her powdered hair replaced by streaks of grey, her skin dulle, her eyes hollowed by grief. But she forced herself to look, because turning away felt like surrendering to the revolution more completely than any trial could. Some nights, she spoke to no one, not even her daughter, choosing instead to sit on the wooden stool by the window and watch the sky shift from blue to purple before night swallowed it whole. She prayed softly, not for rescue, not even for justice, but for clarity, for the strength to endure, until whatever end awaited her. The guards sometimes mocked her prayers, whispering crude jokes through the bars, but she let their words pass over her like wind, refusing to let their cruelty stain the fragile quiet she cultivated inside herself. Her faith had grown thin, but what remained felt sharper than before, as if suffering had stripped it down to something raw and unadorned. Letters were forbidden, yet her mind wrote them endlessly. She composed messages to her daughter's future self, to her absent son, to her husband, whose final breath she never saw. She imagined what she would say if allowed to speak to the world that hated her. Not excuses, not defense, just a truth simple enough to fit into a few breaths that she had tried to love, had tried to endure, had tried to be more than a symbol in a world desperate to bury her under the weight of its own anger. She knew none of those words would ever be heard, but thinking them kept her from sinking into the void that pressed against her at every hour. The tower became not only a prison, but a slow ritual of unmaking. Each day, a new thread of her life was pulled loose. The number of footsteps outside her cell decreased as the revolution grew bolder and bloodier, their attention turning to new enemies while she faded into the background like an aging shadow. She heard rumors through whispered conversations between guards, names of men executed, names of women arrested, the constant grind of machines tearing France apart. She wondered if anyone beyond those walls remembered she was alive. And yet that question mattered less with every passing week. Survival had become less about hope, and more about refusing to let the revolution rewrite her interior world. When she lay awake at night, she often closed her eyes and imagined her children in a meadow somewhere far away. She pictured Louis Charles running through tall grass, laughing as sunlight brushed his hair, and Marie-Thérèse twirling in a dress of pale linen as if the revolution had never touched them. Those visions were not dreams. They were attempts to stitch together a reality the world had stolen. In those moments, she forgot the stone walls. She forgot the guards, the mold, the cold, the hunger. She remembered only the warmth of her son's cheek pressed against her shoulder, the softness of her daughter's hand gripping her fingers, the gentle weight of motherhood that had once anchored her life. But morning would always come, dragging her back into the cell with the metallic clang of keys. The tower reminded her relentlessly that fantasies were luxuries she could no longer afford. Yet even as despair chipped at her, she discovered a strange, almost frightening calm inside herself. She realized she could endure nearly anything if she refused to let them see her break. Because in a world determined to erase her humanity, endurance had become rebellion. And deep in the heart of Paris, where shadows gathered and drums echoed, the revolution sharpened the blade that would one day claim her. But in the tower, Marie Antoinette learned to walk with her back straight in rooms meant to crush her. And that unbroken posture, that steady breath, became the quiet beginning of a final chapter that history would never forget. She began to understand, in those long, unbroken hours inside the temple's upper chambers, that solitude was no longer the absence of sound, but a living creature that settled beside her, breathing slowly, pressing its weight against her ribs until her thoughts felt suspended in a kind of cold, grey fog. Each morning folded into the next like identical pages in a book she had not chosen to read. Yet she turned them anyway, because turning pages was the only motion left that did not belong to the guards. The tower's stone walls had grown familiar enough that she could trace their contours with her eyes closed, following the small cracks like faded rivers on a map. Whenever her fingertips brushed across those lines, she imagined that the stones had absorbed centuries of whispered prayers, last breaths, hidden regrets, and unspoken confessions. She wondered how many other souls had stood exactly where she stood, clinging to dignity in a place that existed solely to take dignity apart piece by piece. Her daughter remained near her for a little longer, and the girl's presence gave her a fragile tether to the world outside the prison walls. Marie would hold the girl's hands between her own, warming them, speaking in soft whispers that echoed faintly in the hollow chamber. She taught her how to braid threads of fabric, how to fold a shawl neatly, how to sit with her back straight even when fear hollowed the chest. But most of all, she tried to teach her how to preserve her inner world, how to build a quiet sanctuary the revolution could not breach. There were nights when Marie-Therese cried herself to sleep, and Marie would hold her close, stroking her hair until the sobs softened. She whispered lullabies from Vienna, songs she had not sung since childhood. And in those moments she felt the strange collapse of time, felt again like the young girl shipped across Europe to become someone else. Someone important. Someone who would never again be allowed to feel small or frightened. The cruel irony was that here, in this tower, stripped of everything she had once been, she was finally allowed to feel all the things Versailles had forbidden: fear, longing, tenderness, and the small, painful freedom of being merely human. Yet the quiet moments never lasted long. Every few hours the guards would return to disrupt whatever fragile peace she had managed to build. They entered the room without greeting, searching through straw, through linens, through the folds of her worn dress, as if expecting her to conjure some weapon out of thin air. Their boots thudded harshly against the wooden floor, and she learned to hold her breath until they left, because breathing while they searched made the air feel contaminated. She had grown accustomed to the way their eyes lingered on her, as though she were an artifact from a world that no longer existed, something to be examined but not respected. Over time, she found that she could retreat inward while they moved around her, shaping her thoughts into a sanctuary deep enough that even jeers and mocking whispers could not penetrate. Her appetite shrank in proportion to her hope. Meals were little more than coarse bread and thin broth served in chipped bowls, but she forced herself to eat, because stopping would imply surrender. Hunger became a dull ache she carried like a stone in her stomach, an ache she learned to ignore as easily as the cold that seeped through the walls. Sometimes, when the guards forgot to shut the window fully, She felt a draught of Parisian winter wind and inhaled it deeply, as though trying to draw in the memory of the gardens she once walked. If she closed her eyes, she could almost imagine the scent of grass, the flutter of silk gowns brushing against gravel paths, the murmured gossip of courtiers hidden beneath the rustle of parasols. But when she opened her eyes again, the scent of mold and sweat returned, and the illusion broke like thin ice under her feet. The absence of news was its own kind of torture. Days passed without word of whether the revolution had calmed or worsened. Occasionally she heard muffled shouts from beyond the tower walls, the distant thud of drums, or the sharp crack of gunfire. Those sounds reminded her of the world's brutality, but they also reminded her that the world continued, indifferent to whether she lived or died. Sometimes the guards argued in the corridor, thinking she could not hear. She picked up fragments, names she recognized, battles she did not understand. Words like traitor, conspiracy, and necessity. She pieced them together like bits of broken pottery, forming a mosaic that told her nothing except that time was thinning, that whatever awaited her would arrive sooner than she wished to believe. In the quietest hours of the night, she confronted memories she had avoided for years: the laughter in Versailles, the masked balls, the glittering dinners, the soft hand of her eldest son slipping from hers as he died long before the revolution ever found its fire. That memory cleaved her chest open in a way even the present suffering could not rival. She saw again the way Louis Joseph had wasted away, how she held him as his breath faded, how the doctors whispered outside the door, how the court lowered their voices for a week, but not long enough. Here, in the tower, that grief felt sharper than the cold. It had become a companion, sitting at the edge of her bed like a shadow waiting to be acknowledged. She let herself remember because forgetting would feel like betrayal. Her children had always been the last warm place in her life, and the memory of them allowed her to survive the hours when even the candlelight seemed to flicker in mourning. Yet some part of her refused to succumb to despair. She wrote imaginary letters in her mind, not because she expected to send them, but because shaping words kept her mind from unraveling. She crafted messages filled with strength and tenderness. Letters she hoped her daughter might one day read in a world gentler than this one. Sometimes she imagined writing to her brother in Vienna, telling him she forgave him for his harsh warnings years ago. Other nights she wrote to her mother, Maria Theresa, whose presence still loomed in her thoughts, stern yet protective, a reminder that she had been raised for duty, even if duty had become a noose. As days stretched into weeks, Marie began to sense that her life was shrinking into a sequence of small choices: how to sit, how to breathe, how to remain upright when the world wanted her to collapse. The revolution could cage her, starve her, humiliate her, but it could not dictate how she held her spine. That realization became a quiet rebellion. She cleaned the room, even though it would never be clean. She braided her hair, even though it no longer shone. She stood when addressed, bowed her head with controlled grace, and treated even her captors with the politeness she believed was the final remnant of her humanity. In these gestures, she reclaimed something the revolution could not strip away: her sense of self. But the tower was not done with her. One night, long after the candles had burned to stubs, and the guards' footsteps thinned into sporadic echoes, she sensed a shift in the air, an uneasiness that pulsed against the stone like a heartbeat out of rhythm. She did not know that preparations were already underway for her transfer, that the revolution planned to move her from the temple to a place far colder, far more isolating, a place where she would no longer have even the comfort of her daughter's presence. She sensed only that the tower had grown restless, as though it knew what she did, not that the next step of her journey would take her deeper into the machinery of death, into a darkness from which there would be no gentle return. And when that darkness finally came, it moved quietly, like a hand closing around a flame. They came for her in the kind of hour when the world feels thin, when the darkness outside presses its forehead against the window and listens for movement inside. Marie had not slept. Sleep had become a stranger long before that night. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, hands folded in her lap, listening to the silence with the uneasy awareness of someone who has lived too long in the shadow of uncertainty. The tower breathed around her, the stones expanding and contracting with the cold. And she felt a tremor in the air, not the tremor of footsteps, not the rustle of guards changing shifts, but something subtler, a subtle tightening, as though the walls knew before she did that the next chapter of her suffering was finally stepping toward her. When the keys scraped harshly against the lock and the door swung open without warning, the shock was not in their arrival, but in the realization that the moment she had feared without naming had finally come. The guards did not explain themselves. They brought a lantern that cast a sickly glow across the walls, stretching her shadow into a long, trembling shape that followed her reluctantly. Maria rose slowly, her joints stiff, her breath measured, and glanced toward her daughter, who had been startled awake by the intrusion. The girl's frightened eyes met her mother's alaudan, and in that silent exchange was a depth of grief that no language could translate. Maria mumbled "Softre assurance," though she knew it was a lie, and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead with the kind of aching gentleness that felt like tearing fabric. She was not allowed more than that. The guards closed the space between them with sharp gestures, ordering her toward the stairwell, and Maria obeyed, because resisting would only frighten her daughter further. She held her spine straight as she walked, forcing each step into a slow rhythm meant to disguise the tremor in her legs. And as she descended the narrow stone stairs, she felt the tower breathe behind her like a living thing, letting her go without pity or pause. Outside the cell, the hallway felt colder, as though the night itself had crept inside the building. Guards walked on either side of her, not with ceremony, but with the brisk efficiency of men carrying out a grim chore. They did not shove her, but their presence hemmed her in tightly, leaving her barely enough room to draw breath. Marie kept her gaze forward, following the lantern light as it swayed, casting dizzy patterns on the walls. She knew better than to ask where she was being taken. Questions had long ago become useless currency in this place. But she sensed, from the silence, from the urgency beneath their movements, from the way they avoided her eyes, that this was no ordinary transfer. Something irreversible had begun. They led her out into the night air, and the cold slapped her with the unexpected force of a memory she could not fully hold. The sky above Paris was moonless, shrouded in a kind of heavy fog that softened every outline until even the buildings looked like ghosts holding their breath. A covered carriage waited near the gate, surrounded by soldiers with muskets glinting faintly beneath the lantern light. She stepped toward it without hesitation, her thin slippers scraping across the cobblestone, and as she climbed inside, she felt a surge of disorientation, as though she were no longer inhabiting her own body, but watching herself from some impossible distance. The carriage door shut behind her with a hollow thud that reverberated through her bones, sealing her into a space so bare it felt more like a coffin than a vehicle. The carriage moved without ceremony, wheels grinding over uneven stones, while Paris slept or pretended to sleep, because the city never slept fully during the Revolution, merely sank into uneasy dozes. Marie sat alone with the lantern flickering overhead, its flame bending with every jolt of the carriage. The shadows on the walls looked like distorted silhouettes of people she once knew, courtiers from Versailles, diplomats from Vienna, her mother's stern figure hovering behind her like some severe guardian. She blinked, and the shadows dissolved, leaving only the trembling flame and the hollow ache in her chest. She wished, absurdly, that she could hear her children's voices one more time, even if only through the memory that had carried her through the darkest nights. But memory was beginning to feel fragile, as if fear were wearing it down, grain by grain. The carriage slowed eventually, though she had no sense of how long the journey had taken. When it stopped, the door opened to reveal a building she had only heard spoken of in low tones. The conciergerie, a place whispered about as though it were less a prison than a devouring maw that swallowed people whole. She stepped out cautiously, feeling the weight of dozens of unseen eyes, watching her from the windows and shadows. The guards ushered her through heavy doors and into a corridor that smelled of damp straw, cold stone, and the stale breath of countless prisoners who had passed through these same halls before her. The walls felt closer here, the ceilings lower, the air thick with a kind of misery that seeped into the bloodstream faster than cold. They placed her in a small cell, barely wide enough to stretch her arms, and the floor was uneven, covered in straw that smelled of mildew. A single chair stood in one corner, rickety and splintered, and the straw mattress in the opposite corner sagged as though it had already absorbed too many years of suffering. A guard stationed himself directly outside the bars, sitting on a stool, watching her with an expression that was neither cruel nor compassionate, but simply numb. She understood then that the revolution had not assigned her captors to torment her. The revolution had simply worn them down until they had no cruelty left to give. Marie sat slowly on the mattress, feeling the dampness soak into her dress. She folded her hands again, not out of habit, but because she needed something steady to anchor her. The silence in the cell was different from the silence in the temple tower. This silence felt predatory, as though it stalked her from the corners, waiting for her to break. She refused to move for several minutes, breathing so shallowly it felt as though she might slip out of existence entirely. When she finally exhaled, the sound echoed faintly against the stone, startling her with its fragility. Over the next days, though, she lost all sense of whether it was day or night. The routines of the conciergerie pulled her deeper into a life stripped to its barest edges. Guards watched her constantly, recording every motion, every sigh, every whisper. She was not allowed privacy even to wash. Her body was searched daily for objects she never possessed. Food arrived irregularly, bowls placed on the floor by men who did not meet her eyes. She ate only enough to stay conscious, because hunger had become a familiar ache she could not afford to indulge. And all the while, the knowledge burned quietly beneath her ribs. She was being prepared, not for life, for the trial that would lead her to death. Her sleep grew thin, coming only in scraps, the kind of shallow drifting that left her waking with a start. Sometimes she would sit upright in the dark, convinced she heard her children calling her name, their voices weaving through the stones like threads pulled from memory. She pressed her hands to her ears to block it out, knowing it was nothing more than grief playing tricks. The walls offered no comfort. They absorbed her fears with indifferent patience. Yet for all the despair that weighed upon her, Marie discovered within herself a strange, trembling clarity. She realized there was nothing left they could take except her composure, and so she guarded that composure fiercely. When the guards mocked her, she did not answer. When they brought news meant to wound her, she listened with a stillness that unsettled even them. When she prayed not for salvation, but for endurance. She no longer imagined escape, no longer imagined rescue. She imagined only walking with dignity, no matter how narrow the path grew. And somewhere deep inside the conciergerie, where footsteps echoed like the ticking of a countdown clock she could not see, Marie Antoinette felt the future pressing toward her. The trial was coming. The blade was coming. But until that moment arrived, she would sit in that damp cell, spine straight, eyes steady, holding on to the last fragile fragment of herself that the revolution had not yet claimed The days inside the conciergerie began to lose their borders, dissolving into one long, heavy ribbon of time that pressed itself against Marie until she no longer recognized morning from evening or waking from dreaming. The cell seemed to shrink with each passing hour, not because the walls moved, but because her mind learned every inch of the space until it felt like a second skin she could not escape. The straw beneath her mattress grew damp with her breath, and the cold rising from the stone floor, and the single candle they allowed her sputtered more often than it burned, leaving her in a darkness that vibrated with the weight of her own heartbeat. She had always feared silence, but now she feared sound more, because every sound meant someone was approaching, someone was watching, someone was preparing to take another piece of her life. The guards changed shifts with the monotony of a clock she could not see, each man bringing a different kind of emptiness into the hallway. Some walked with heavy boots that announced their presence in angry echoes. Others moved with a softer drag as though sleepiness pulled at their limbs. But all of them watched her with the same glazed detachment of men who had seen too much pain to recognize it anymore. She wondered sometimes if they avoided looking at her directly because they feared they might find traces of themselves reflected in the hollow of her eyes. Some lingering memory of gentleness they had buried to survive the revolution. She learned to read their silences instead. Noticing small gestures that revealed more than words, could one man polished his boots nervously whenever executions increased. Another hummed under his breath at dawn, as if to chase away nightmares. And yet another paused each night before leaving, his gaze lingering in the direction of her cell, but never stepping close enough for conversation. Food arrived in the same bowl each day, a rough clay dish chipped at the rim, filled with broth so thin it barely clung to the spoon. The bread they provided grew harder as the days passed, and sometimes she held a piece in her hand for long minutes before forcing herself to eat it. Not because she lacked hunger, but because she refused to let hunger dictate the only decisions she still controlled. Eating became a ritual, not of survival but of defiance. A quiet reminder to herself that she had not fully surrendered to the machinery designed to break her. She drank water that tasted faintly of rust and stone, sipping slowly, so the coldness would settle gently in her chest rather than shock her already weakened body. As sleep slipped further from her reach, her mind began to drift into strange spaces where memory and imagination blurred. Sometimes she saw her mother standing in the corner of the cell, stern and composed, the figure of a woman who had built entire empires with her will alone. And Marie would whisper apologies before remembering the image was nothing more than the shape of a shadow cast by her candle. Other times she imagined she heard her son's laugh, echoing faintly across the stone. A soft, bright sound that had once filled her life with meaning. She would close her eyes and hold on to the illusion for as long as she dared, letting it warm her from the inside, even though she knew the truth that the boy who laughed in her memory no longer existed in the way she wanted to remember him. The revolution had taken even that from her, twisting his innocence into a weapon wielded against her during her trial. And she knew those false accusations had carved deeper wounds than any physical blow ever could. Occasionally, a priest visited her cell, though he was not the priest she once trusted. This one spoke with hurried formality, delivering prayers as though they were obligations rather than comforts. And Marie listened politely, because politeness was a habit she could not abandon. Yet she felt no solace in his presence. She had long since stopped seeking salvation through external voices. Salvation had become something she needed to craft herself, in the quiet folds of her thoughts, in the way she held her spine. Even when her body ached so deeply, she feared it might bend permanently. She prayed only for clarity, for the strength to stand when the moment demanded it, for the ability to face what lay ahead without allowing fear to strip away the last of her dignity. Her body changed with each passing day. Her hair, once powdered and adorned with jewels, hung limp and uneven from where the guards had cut it brutally. Her skin grew paler, translucent almost, stretched too tightly along her cheekbones, and her hands trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. So profound it lived in her bones. Yet despite the physical deterioration, she felt something inside her sharpening. Pain had burned away the outer layers of who she once was, leaving behind a smaller, colder, more defined core. A core made not of royal pride, but of a kind of quiet resilience. She began to understand that survival was no longer about escaping death, but about refusing to be diminished before it arrived. The nights became the hardest to endure. She would lie awake and listen to the city beyond the walls, imagining the lives that continued without pause, children running through narrow streets, vendors calling out their wares, families gathering in dimly lit rooms, unaware of how close death roamed through their world. She imagined the laughter, the warmth of the hearth, the murmur of conversations drifting through open windows, and she ached for those ordinary sounds more deeply than she ever ached for the luxury of Versailles. Ordinary life had become the most unattainable dream of all. Trial preparations began subtly. She noticed when guards whispered more urgently, when officials passed by her cell, with documents clutched tightly in their hands, when the air itself seemed charged with sharp anticipation. They believed she did not see the shift, but she had lived too long inside courts and palaces not to recognize the tightening of political tension. Her trial would not be a trial at all. She understood this instinctively. It would be a performance, a spectacle crafted not to reveal truth, but to justify what they had already decided. She was no longer a defendant. She was a symbol soaked in the fears and failures of a nation in collapse. Throughout the days leading to the trial, she prepared herself not with speeches but with silence. Words could be twisted, misinterpreted, used against her. But silence. Silence was her own. She practiced breathing evenly when fear threatened to seize her chest. Practiced, keeping her gaze steady, even when exhaustion blurred the edges of her vision. She prayed not for mercy but for composure, because composure was the only weapon she had left, and it was one they feared more than any defense she could offer. Eventually, the cell door creaked open, with a tension that told her the moment had arrived. The guard who entered did not look at her, but his posture carried the weight of the news he did not speak. Marie stood, smoothing the folds of her dress, and allowed them to chain her hands with cold metal that bit into her wrists. She felt no shock, nor trembling panics, only a deep, steady breath rising in her chest. The future had finally begun to walk toward her with deliberate steps. She stepped forward to meet it. They led her from the cell with a kind of procedural indifference that made the moment even more surreal, as though they were escorting a shadow rather than a woman who had once been the brightest figure in the royal court of Europe. The metal around her wrists bit deeper with every movement, cold enough to numb her skin, yet she welcomed the sting because it reminded her she was still capable of feeling something. She walked through the corridor where countless prisoners had passed before her, the walls marked with scratches left by fingernails or knives or desperation, each mark a ghost trapped in stone. Marie watched them with a strange sense of kinship, as if the voices of the dead whispered to her through the cracks, urging her to step carefully into the final act of her own unraveling. The hallway opened into a larger chamber, where the air felt heavy with moisture and the faint smell of ink and sweat. Men waited for her, officials of the revolution, dressed in rough, dark fabric, their faces pale from sleepless nights, and their eyes burning with a fervor she recognized too well. These were not men guided by reason, but by hunger, the kind of hunger that devours thought and replaces it with a rigid certainty. They looked at her not with hatred, but with a frightening sort of fascination, as if staring at a myth that had unexpectedly stepped into their mundane world. She ignored their gazes. concentrating instead on the steady rhythm of her breath, the rise and fall that anchored her to the present moment. A stack of documents lay on the table before them, sealed and signed, but she knew none of those pages contained truth. Truth had no place here. It had been replaced by a carefully constructed narrative in which she had been cast as the villain long before she ever entered the room. The officials read aloud portions of the accusations in sharp, clipped tones, barely pausing to breathe, as though the speed of their speech determined the validity of their words. She stood perfectly still, listening not to what they said, but to the intention carved into their voices. Every sentence was designed not to question her, but to condemn her. They wanted her to stumble, to object, to break, to offer them the satisfaction of watching a queen dissolve before their eyes. But she refused them even that. Instead, she raised her chin slightly. Drawing on a reserve of composure she had not known, she still possessed. Her silence unsettled them. One man's voice caught mid-sentence. Another shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the others as if searching for reassurance. Marie saw the tremor ripple through them and understood something profound. The revolution was afraid of her, not of her power, which had been stripped away long ago, nor of her influence, which had evaporated like smoke, but of her poise, dignity. She realized, was a weapon sharper than any blade. When they finished reading the charges, the room sank into a heavy stillness. One of the officials demanded she respond, his voice cracking slightly, revealing his own fear beneath the veneer of authority. She met his gaze, her eyes steady, her voice soft but unwavering, and answered with a restraint that astonished even her. She did not argue, she did not defend. She chose her words with the precision of a surgeon making a single, clean incision. Every phrase floated into the stale air with a weight that made them shift in their seats. She spoke not for them, but for herself, preserving a layer of truth that no verdict could erase. When she finished, the silence that followed felt like a held breath stretching toward its breaking point. They did not allow her to return to her cell immediately. Instead, they escorted her to another room, one colder and even more suffocating, where she waited under the unblinking gaze of guards who tried not to meet her eyes. The wooden bench beneath her felt hard and foreign, as if rejecting her presence. She clasped her hands in her lap, noticing how thin they had become, the bones protruding slightly beneath her skin. The transformation of her body no longer startled her. It felt inevitable, a physical manifestation of all she had endured. She rested her head against the wall, letting the coolness seep into her scalp, and allowed her thoughts to drift only far enough to keep her sane. She imagined, for a moment, the corridors of Versailles. She imagined the grand mirrors reflecting her younger self, adorned in gowns that shimmered like starlight, the rustle of silk whispering secrets as she glided across polished floors. She remembered the gardens blooming with roses heavy enough to bow their stems, the taste of sweet pastries at dusk, the gentle echo of laughter during winter evenings. The memories did not comfort her, but they grounded her, reminding her she had lived a life full of texture and color before the world narrowed into shades of grey. She wondered if France remembered that woman, or if the revolution had successfully buried her beneath the mountain of falsehoods they had built. She wondered, too, if her children would remember her face, the real one, not the grotesque caricature drawn in pamphlets. A pang pierced her heart, but she welcomed it. Pain, she realized, was another form of memory, and memory was all she had left. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time felt disjointed. Eventually, they returned to bring her into yet another space, this one larger and filled with figures seated on benches arranged in rows. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she entered, the sound amplifying the tension that thickened the air. She recognized instantly what this was, the place where her judgment would be performed. The men assembled here looked at her with a mixture of triumph and unease, as though they wanted to believe they held power over her, but could not completely silence the small, frightened questions stirring beneath their certainty. She was guided to a designated spot, and she stood with her hands still bound, her posture straight, her face calm. They began to address her, their words sharp, forceful, each accusation like a stone thrown against the wall of her composure, but she did not flinch. She answered only when necessary, and when she spoke, her voice was so steady that it rippled through the room like a cold wind. She felt the moment shift. She felt it in the way several jurors exchanged glances, in the sudden stiffness of the prosecutor's shoulders, in the hesitation that clung to the edges of their questions. They wanted her to be monstrous. They needed her to be monstrous. But she refused to fit the shape they had carved for her. Her courage did not come from pride. It came from exhaustion, from the realization that there was nothing left to gain or lose. She had already lived through the worst nights of her life. She had already lost her children, her husband, her home. What remained was a kind of clarity she had never known before, a clarity that told her she could face death with more dignity than many of the living could manage. She understood that the revolution would kill her, but she also understood that her composure would outlive her. As the session dragged on, she felt her strength waning. Her body trembled beneath her gown, though she kept the motion small enough that only she could feel it. She thought of her daughter again, imagined her small hands folded in prayer, imagined her surviving long enough to carry a memory of her mother, untouched by hatred. Marie allowed herself that single hope. It was enough to keep her upright. When the hearing adjourned for the day, they led her back through the dim corridors. The lanterns flickered as she passed, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls like restless spirits. She walked in silence, letting the darkness close around her like a cloak. She had not been shattered. She had not been diminished. She had been tested, and she had endured, and as the heavy cell door slammed behind her, she realized with an unexpected steadiness that she would endure again. She did not know how many more days she had left, but she knew she would meet each of them standing, her gaze steady, her voice quiet but unbroken, until the journey reached its final edge, where the blade waited like an unblinking eye. The nights that followed the opening session of her trial folded into each other with the same suffocating heaviness that had become the rhythm of her imprisonment. Yet something subtle had shifted inside her, a quiet tightening of resolve that pulsed beneath her ribs like a second heartbeat. She understood now, with a clarity sharper than any blade that awaited her, that the trial was not meant to test her guilt, but to demolish the last remaining fragments of who she had been. It was not the accusations themselves that revealed this, but the hunger in the eyes of the men who hurled them at her, as if the entire weight of the revolution depended on watching her fracture beneath their words. But she did not fracture. She absorbed each lie, each distortion, each venomous insinuation with a stillness that unnerved even her captors. And that stillness, paradoxically, became the very thing that pushed them to escalate their cruelty. The next morning began with the familiar, metallic scrape of the cell door, but this time the guards entered with a haste that made the air vibrate. Their boots struck the floor harder, their faces taut with rehearsed severity, their posture signaling that they had been instructed to maintain even stricter control over her movements. Mary rose slowly, letting the weariness settle into her limbs before suppressing it beneath a layer of composure. They bound her wrists again, though more tightly than before, as if the ropes themselves were meant to punish her for the mere act of surviving, and ushered her into the hallway where the lanterns flickered weakly against the damp walls. She felt the shift the moment they began descending the stairs toward the chamber where the trial would resume. It was not the temperature, or the lighting, or the presence of new guards. It was the smell, an acidic blend of sweat, ink, damp wool, and stale breath. It smelled like fear. Not her own, but theirs. The room was packed more densely with spectators than the day before. A sea of bodies pressed elbow to elbow, all eager to witness the unraveling of a queen. Their whispers crashed softly like waves against stone, rising and falling with crude suggestions, breathless anticipation, and venom masked as righteous fury. She stepped into the space with her shoulders squared, her face drained of color, but not of resolve, and a strange hush rippled through the room, the kind that precedes an unpredictable storm. The prosecutor stood at the center, his chest puffed with theatrical hostility, his voice slicing through the air as he launched into accusations more grotesque than those she had endured previously. He spoke of treason, of secret alliances, of whispering foreign influence into the king's ear. Each charge embellished with flourishes, meant to provoke the crowd into outrage. But when those fabrications failed to draw a reaction from her, he escalated, pushing past political condemnation into the realm of personal violation. He uttered allegations so vile that even the most fervent supporters of the revolution shifted uncomfortably. He forced her son's coerced testimony into the open again, wielding the boy's broken words like a dagger, designed not to kill her body, but to mutilate her memory. The room stirred, a faint murmur rising like steam as people exchanged glances. Uncertain for the first time whether this performance was justice or cruelty, Marie did not crumble. She did not scream. She did not lash out. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes focused not on the prosecutor, but on the far wall, as if searching for something beyond the confines of the room. When the accusations reached their vilest point, she lifted her chin and spoke with a voice so soft it forced the entire chamber into silence. She said only what she had to say, nothing more, nothing less, and the truth in her tone, the quiet, unadorned truth of a mother whose bond had not been broken by lies, thickened the air until the prosecutor himself faltered. For a moment, the entire theatre of hatred was suspended, as though the room had suddenly remembered that it contained not a symbol, but a woman. The moment passed quickly, swallowed by shouts from the gallery. Yet something fundamental had shifted. She could feel it. The cruelty of the trial began to feel desperate, as if the revolutionaries were racing against time, aware that the spectacle they had promised the people might collapse beneath the weight of its own contradictions, if they allowed her humanity to shine through even briefly. So they hurried. They called witnesses who had never met her. They presented letters forged by hands that trembled with political ambition. They asked questions designed not to gather truth, but to twist it. And through it all, Marie maintained her posture, her silence, her ability to answer with a calm that felt almost supernatural. Each hour of the trial pressed heavily on her body. Her legs weakened, her breath shortened, her skin took on a pallor that bordered on translucence. Yet she refused to ask for rest. To ask would be to give them permission to claim she was fragile. A final victory she would not grant. Instead, she leaned imperceptibly against the wooden rail, letting it absorb the trembling in her knees, while keeping her face lifted toward the tribunal, like a statue carved from the last remnants of her soul. As the session dragged into the afternoon, she began to sense the finality closing around her like a tightening noose. The jurors no longer looked at her when the prosecutor spoke. They kept their eyes lowered, fixed on the floorboards, as though trying to avoid the weight of the verdict they had already decided upon. She did not hate them. Strangely, she felt the faintest flicker of pity. They were men caught in a storm much larger than themselves. Men who feared the blade as deeply as she did. Men who understood that mercy was a luxury the revolution had forbidden them to feel. When the proceedings finally ended for the day, the air in the chamber felt suffocating. She felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet as the guards took hold of her arms, guiding her back through the corridor, where the spectators hissed and spat and yelled. The sound no longer pierced her. She had grown beyond their hatred. Or perhaps beneath it, sinking into a depth of quiet where their voices could not reach. As she was led away, she caught the faint smell of roasting chestnuts drifting in from an open window, a scent so ordinary it made her heart ache. She wondered if anyone in the streets knew what had happened inside. If anyone understood how close she had come to collapsing, how close the prosecutor had come to breaking under the weight of her silence. Back in her cell, the guard closed the door with a force that sent a cold tremor across the stone floor. She sank slowly onto the straw mattress, feeling the stiffness in her spine give way to a deep, shuddering exhale. For several minutes, she sat without moving, letting the weight of the day settle into her bones, letting her thoughts drift not toward fear, but toward memory. She thought of her daughter, of her son, of evenings in Versailles, when the world seemed stretched open with possibility, and she allowed herself a single tear, not of despair, but of exhaustion. Then she wiped it away. Tomorrow the trial would continue. Tomorrow they would strip her of the last veneers of her life. But tonight she still had her breath, her dignity, her thin, flickering candle of resilience, and she would keep that flame alive until the very last moment, no matter how dark the corridors of the conciergerie grew. The night after the second day of her trial felt different from all the nights before, not because the darkness was heavier or the cold sharper, but because something inside Marie had begun to loosen, a quiet acceptance settling beneath her ribs like a final, steady breath. She did not mistake this acceptance for surrender. It was not the soft collapse of someone who had given up. It was the stillness of someone who had finally seen the shape of her own ending and realized she would meet it on her own terms. The candle flickered faintly on the small table beside her, spreading a thin circle of gold across the cell, and she watched its trembling flame with a strange tenderness, as if it were the last fragile companion she would ever have. The shadows moved against the stone in soft ripples, merging into a single dark pool that seemed to breathe with her, and she let that breath guide her deeper into the quiet. She lay back on the straw mattress, folding her hands over her stomach, feeling the ache in her joints radiate outward like a slow-burning fire. Her thoughts drifted toward her children, not in the frantic way they once did, but in a way that felt warm and distant, like sunlight remembered on a cold morning. She pictured her daughter's face, the delicate features sharpened by fear and the weight of loss, and she whispered a silent blessing into the darkness. She imagined her son not as the boy distorted in false testimony, not as the pale figure imprisoned somewhere beyond the reach of her arms, but as the child he had been laughing, curled into her side, his breath warm against her neck. Those memories, once sharp enough to cut, now felt softened by time, their edges dulled by a strange, gentle sorrow that no longer overwhelmed her. The guard's footsteps approached and retreated with the same monotonous rhythm. Yet tonight, their movement seemed more tentative, as though even they sensed the fragile balance of the moment. One paused near her cell for longer than usual, his breathing audible through the bars, a faint tremor in each inhale as though he wanted to speak but could not summon the words. Marie did not look up. She respected silence too much to break it for the sake of curiosity. She only listened, letting the muffled sounds of the conciergerie fill the room, the distant murmur of prisoners shifting in their sleep, the drip of water seeping down old stone, the faint rustle of straw beneath her own body. The world had grown so small, so quiet, and yet she felt more present than she ever had in the glittering noise of Versailles. Sleep came in fragments. She drifted into it like someone stepping cautiously onto thin ice, never letting herself sink fully in. Her dreams were blurred. Hazy shapes of memories and imaginings tangled together in a delicate web. She saw her mother again, the proud empress whose gaze had once pierced through silk and ceremony. And for the first time since childhood, Marie felt no fear in that gaze. She saw her sister, smiling softly. She saw the Austrian hills of her youth, the green expanses she had not walked in decades. And then the dream shifted, as dreams often did, and she found herself standing in the Hall of Mirrors. Her reflection multiplied endlessly, each version of herself gazing back with expressions she no longer recognized. Some were young and radiant, others tired and worn. And in the center stood the woman. She was now hair cropped close, face hollowed, eyes steady. When she awoke, her breath caught in her throat, as though she had been crying in her sleep. Yet her cheeks were dry. Dawn approached without light. In the conciergerie, the morning was announced, not by the sun but by the change in the sounds echoing through the corridors. Keys turned, boots thudded, murmurs swelled like a distant tide. The guards came earlier than usual, their movements stiff, their faces expressionless, and Marie rose slowly, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. They tied her wrists once more, though this time with a cold efficiency that made her heart beat a little faster. She walked between them through the winding hallways, her footsteps soft, the rope biting gently into her skin. And as she moved, she realized she felt something strange, a calm so profound, it felt almost like detachment. She entered the courtroom again, greeted by the same oppressive heat of too many bodies pressed together, the same acrid smell of sweat and old wood, the same charged silence waiting to erupt at the slightest provocation. The prosecutor resumed his performance with renewed intensity, flinging accusations like stones, hurled from a collapsing wall. But Marie heard them from a distance, as though they were being shouted across a vast, echoing canyon she no longer inhabited. She watched him with steady eyes, and in that gaze he faltered, his voice breaking, the mask of righteous fury, slipping just enough to reveal the trembling beneath. He recovered quickly, drawing strength from the crowd, but she had seen it, the crack in his composure, the flicker of doubt. Witness after witness was summoned, each one weaving tales that grew more absurd with every breath. She listened with the quiet patience of someone watching a storm spend itself, waiting for the moment when it would finally blow itself out. She answered questions with restraint, knowing that her dignity was the only weapon she still held. The jurors' eyes darted away from her whenever she looked at them, ashamed, perhaps, or simply unwilling to face the humanity they were attempting to erase. By afternoon, the prosecutor had grown visibly exhausted, his theatrics fraying at the edges. His words lost some of their venom, replaced by a strained urgency that bordered on desperation. Marie sensed that he wanted the trial to end, not because he feared her innocence, but because he feared her endurance. As if the longer she stood before them, unbroken, the more fragile the revolution's narrative became. She felt her own strength waning, her knees weakening beneath her. But she refused to sit, refused to ask for water, refused to show a single crack. There was power in suffering silently, a power she never sought, but now wielded with an instinctive understanding. When the session finally closed for the day and they led her back to her cell, the sun had set behind the city, casting Paris into a dim blue twilight. She felt the exhaustion settle over her like a thick blanket, pulling at her limbs, whispering invitations to collapse. But she resisted until the guards closed the door behind her. Only then did she sit, lowering herself slowly onto the straw mattress, her back leaning against the damp wall as her breath shook faintly in her chest. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for freedom, not for mercy, but for strength to face whatever remained. The room grew quieter. The sounds of the prison faded into a distant hum. And in that pocket of stillness, in that space where the world briefly loosened its grip, she made a promise to herself that no matter what verdict awaited her, she would meet it with the same calm that had carried her through the darkest hours of her life. Outside, the conciergerie loomed like a stone creature holding its breath, waiting for the moment when history would step inside and claim its next chapter. And Marie, fragile yet unbroken, prepared herself to walk into that chapter with her head high. The dawn that followed her last day in the courtroom arrived not with colour but with a cold, metallic certainty, as though the air itself had already heard the verdict before it was spoken. Marie had not slept. Her eyes had remained open through the night, tracing the faint lines of light cast upon the ceiling each time a guard walked past with a lantern. Her body felt heavier than it ever had, not with fear, but with the profound exhaustion of someone who has carried too much sorrow for too long. She lay still, listening to the soft creaking of the prison settling around her, the distant murmur of footsteps echoing through the corridors, and the faint scrape of metal against metal as keys turned somewhere far away. Every sound felt like a countdown, though she no longer tried to measure the minutes left to her. Time had become a fluid thing, stretching and contracting with the weight of her thoughts. When the door opened, the guards entered with an air of practiced formality, their faces stiff, their movements precise. They did not need to tell her what the day would bring. The gravity in their steps, the way they avoided her eyes, said everything. Maria rose slowly, pressing her palms against the straw mattress to steady herself, before standing. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she straightened her spine and adjusted her dress with careful movements, smoothing the wrinkles as though preparing for an event rather than an ending. She did not rush. She allowed each gesture to be deliberate, a silent reclaiming of the dignity that had been stripped from her piece by piece. They bound her wrists again, though more gently this time, as if some small part of them recognized that the battle was already over. She followed them into the corridor, her footsteps soft, the ropes brushing against her skin with a severity that no longer startled her. The prison seemed quieter than usual, the stones holding an unusual stillness that made her think of a chapel before a funeral, a place where even the walls knew to stay silent. As they descended the stairway that led to the courtroom, she inhaled deeply, letting the cold air settle in her lungs, grounding her in the moment. The courtroom was filled again, more crowded than ever, every bench occupied, the aisles thick with bodies pressed together in tense anticipation. The air felt heavy with breath and sweat, and the unspoken thirst for closure that radiated from every corner. She entered without hesitation, her chin lifted just slightly, her gaze level, her movements betraying none of the fatigue gnawing at her bones. The murmuring in the gallery dimmed as she approached her designated place, a hush spreading through the crowd like ripples on dark water. She stood before the tribunal, waiting. Hier expression, unreadable. The prosecutor rose, his voice carrying the same brittle intensity as before, but now tinged with something sharper, something that hinted at triumph. He spoke quickly, almost too quickly, as though the words themselves burned in his mouth. He recited the charges again, each one more damning than the last, each crafted not to seek truth, but to justify an ending already set in motion. Marie listened without blinking, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above his head, absorbing the venom in his tone without letting it touch her. She had reached a place beyond outrage, beyond fear, beyond the need to correct the lies. She understood that truth no longer lived in that room, and she refused to stoop to the level of a performance designed to strip her of her humanity. When he finished, a heavy stillness settled over the courtroom. The jurors exchanged brief glances, their expressions tense, their shoulders stiffening, as though bracing themselves for the announcement. And then, with a voice as flat and emotionless as winter rain, the foreman delivered the verdict. Guilty. Guilty on all charges. The sentence, death by guillotine. Not a murmur of surprise moved through the crowd. The revolution had been moving toward this moment for months. And now that it had arrived, it felt less like justice and more like the final swing of a pendulum that had long been set in motion. Marie did not bow her head. She did not gasp or tremble or plead. She simply closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, letting the weight of the decision settle deep within her before opening them again with a calm that felt almost otherworldly. She nodded once, so subtly that only those closest to her could see it. And then she allowed the guards to take her arms and lead her away. As she walked out of the courtroom, the murmurs rose again, but she did not look back. She stepped into the hallway with the same quiet grace she had carried through the trial, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone. They led her to a small room where she was permitted to sit. Though they did not remove her restraints, a constitutional priest entered, offering her words of solace that she accepted, politely, but without deep engagement. She did not resist the rituals. They were part of the world she had once inhabited, but she found her comfort elsewhere now, in the steady rhythm of her own breath, in the gentle repetition of prayers whispered under her breath, in the knowledge that she had endured more than anyone expected and had done so with dignity intact. As the night crept closer, the guards moved with more urgency, preparing her for the morning to come. They brought her a plain white shift to wear, symbolic of purity. Though the symbolism had been twisted by the revolution into something crueler, she changed without complaint, her hands trembling only slightly as she folded her old garments and set them aside. They cut her hair close to her head, the cold scissors scraping against her scalp, the strands falling silently to the floor like pieces of her past life being swept away. She did not cry, though the pressure in her chest felt momentarily unbearable. When the preparations ended, they left her alone in the cell, with a candle that flickered unsteadily, casting her shadow in large, wavering shapes along the walls. She sat beside the candle, her hands clasped, her breath gentle. She felt neither courage nor despair now, only a strange clarity that held her firmly in place. She had no illusions about what the next day would bring. But she also knew that her final moments would belong to her, not to the men who had condemned her. For the first time since entering the conciergerie, she allowed herself to imagine peace. Not the peace of freedom, not the peace of return, but a deeper peace, one untouched by courts or crowds or chains. She prayed softly, not for rescue, but for a quiet heart. And as she prayed, the candle guttered, sending thin trails of smoke swirling upward, twisting gently in the cold air. When the flame finally steadied, she felt the heaviness settle deep within her bones. The heaviness, not of fear, but of a life approaching its last sunrise. The candle had burned so low that its flame looked like a trembling pearl balanced on the edge of sleep, when the sound of keys turning broke the final pocket of silence she had kept for herself. Marie did not lift her head at first. She simply inhaled, a long, steady breath that tasted of damp straw, stone dust, and the faint sweetness of wax melting away. She had known they would come before dawn. The night had carried a strange pressure, as if the hours themselves were winding tighter and tighter, preparing to snap. When she finally opened her eyes, the cell was awash in a pale, bluish gloom that softened the sharpness of every corner, making even the iron bars appear gentler, as though the world itself wished to spare her from seeing it too clearly. The guards entered with a heaviness that suggested they, too, felt the weight of what the morning demanded, Their boots scraped against the floor in uneven rhythms, and Marie sensed their discomfort in the way they avoided her gaze. She rose slowly, careful to steady her body before standing fully upright. Knowing that weakness now would not serve her, she adjusted the thin white shift they had given her, smoothing the fabric along her sides, feeling the coldness of the air press against her neck where her hair had been cut short. When they bound her wrists, the rope felt rough, biting gently into her skin, yet she did not flinch. She simply held her breath a moment longer, letting the sensation anchor her to her body, to the moment, to the final small thread that tied her to the world of the living. They led her from the cell into the corridor, where lantern flames cast trembling halos along the stone. The conciergerie, usually alive with muffled voices and distant clatter, felt strangely muted. Even the prisoners, who often moaned or called out in the dark, remained silent as she passed, as if some instinct deeper than fear warned them that this was someone walking her last steps. Marie listened to the echo of her footfalls, soft and measured, feeling each step tremble faintly through her ankles. Yet she kept her back straight, held her chin level, and moved with the same poise she once carried through the mirrored halls of Versailles. It was not vanity. It was the last gift she could give herself. The courtyard outside was washed in the blue of early morning, the kind of dim light that blurs the boundary between night and day. The chill wrapped itself around her like a shroud, but she welcomed it. It sharpened her senses. A low wooden cart stood waiting, pulled by a tired horse whose breath puffed in slow clouds. She approached without hesitation, stepping toward the plank with legs that strained under the weight of the moment. The executioner offered his hand in a gesture devoid of cruelty, and she accepted it, allowing him to help her climb onto the cart. When she settled into place, the rough wood pressed against her legs, and the rope around her wrists tightened slightly. The cart lurched forward. Paris unfolded before her in slow, unyielding motion. The building seemed muted in the morning haze, their windows reflecting faint streaks of pale light. Early risers stood along the streets, their faces drawn with curiosity or resentment or disbelief, their breaths forming small clouds that drifted away before dissolving into the air. Some people shouted insults. Others stood silent. A few crossed themselves when they saw her. Whether in pity or fear or reverence, she could not say. She felt their eyes on her like a cold wind brushing across her skin. Yet she kept her gaze steady, occasionally lifting her face to the pale sky as though seeking something through the shifting grey. The cart wheels rattled loudly over uneven stones, and each jolt travelled through her bones. She felt strangely light, as if her body were beginning to loosen its hold on her spirit, making room for the inevitability, drawing nearer with each heartbeat. The rhythm of the journey became a kind of meditative beat, a slow, solemn drum guiding her toward the square where thousands waited. She did not think of the blade. She did not think of the spectacle. She thought instead of the swing she once asked to be built in the gardens of Versailles, the way the wind caught her hair, as she soared briefly into a sky that felt endless, the way she laughed, then young, unburdened, unaware of the storm that would one day tear her life apart. That memory rose gently in her mind, a soft echo of who she once was. As the cart approached the Place de la Révolution, the noise increased, swelling into a chaotic blend of shouts, gasps, and murmurs. The guillotine stood at the center like a monstrous sentinel, its wooden frame stained with the dark signatures of those who had come before her. The blade glinted coldly under the growing light. Marie felt the world narrow to a single point, not fear, but the sharp clarity that comes when all illusions fall away. She stepped down from the cart with the executioner's assistance, her legs trembling slightly, her breath shallow but controlled. The boards beneath her feet creaked as she ascended the scaffold. The drumbeats stopped. Silence, thick and trembling, spread across the square as she reached the top. Marie moved with a deliberate grace, positioning herself where the executioner indicated. Her simple white shift fluttered slightly in the wind, brushing against her knees like a final touch of gentleness. She turned briefly to the executioner and stepped inadvertently on his foot. Her voice, soft yet clear enough for those nearby to hear, whispered, "Pardon me, Sire, I did not do it on purpose." It was so small a phrase, so simple, so human, that even the soldiers nearest to her swallowed hard. In that moment, she became not a queen, not a prisoner, but a person who met the world's cruelty with the last remnants of her civility. She knelt. The executioner guided her forward, positioning her neck in the wooden cradle. She closed her eyes, exhaling a long breath that left her body like the final unspooling of thread from a spool. The air around her felt suspended, held in place by the collective gasp of thousands. She did not pray for rescue. She prayed only for peace for her children, for her sister, for the quiet that would follow the thunder of the blade. The guillotine fell. A single, brutal sound tore through the square, the crack of wood and steel colliding, followed by a collective cry from the crowd that surged like a tidal wave. Marie's body, freed from the final weight of life, slumped forward. Her head dropped into the basket lined with straw, her hair close-cropped, her face serene in death, in a way she had not been allowed in life. The executioner lifted it briefly, showing it to the crowd, as revolution demanded. Some cheered, some trembled. At least one person, hidden among the masses, felt something break in the silence left behind. Within minutes, her remains were carried away without ceremony, wrapped in coarse fabric, taken to an unmarked grave where no monument stood. Lime was thrown over her, the final indignity in a world determined to erase the memory of who she had truly been. But history, stubborn and persistent, refused to let her vanish. It carried her name like a bruise beneath the skin of France. And long after the cheers faded, long after the blade dulled, long after the revolution consumed its own architects, something remained of her, the stillness of a woman who met death with more dignity than a nation could bear, the quiet resistance of a heart that refused to break even when the world demanded it. When the shouts of Paris finally dissolved into the afternoon haze, and the cart carrying her body disappeared beyond the edge of the square, Marie Antoinette's story did not end beneath the falling blade. Instead, it began to echo in ways the revolution never intended. The woman they once called a monster, a foreign parasite, a frivolous queen who danced while France starved, slipped out of the world with a whisper of apology on her lips and a dignity so unyielding that the moment her head fell, a hush travelled through the crowd like a shiver of recognition. Her death did not refill empty grain stores or undo the failures of monarchs, but it left behind something far heavier, a reflection of what happens when a nation, blinded by rage and hungry for symbols, forgets that even its enemies are human. In the quiet that followed the blade's thunder, France had to confront the uncomfortable truth that the woman they killed did not resemble the caricature they had created to justify her destruction. Buried in an unmarked grave, covered hastily with quicklime as though her body were an inconvenience rather than a chapter of history, Marie became more dangerous in death than she had ever been in life. She lingered not as the extravagant Queen of Versailles, but as a mirror held up to a revolution that devoured those who questioned it and then devoured those who served it. And when, one by one, the very men who had condemned her mounted the same scaffold, Paris began to understand that they had not executed a tyrant, but extinguished a warning. Her absence carved a hollow space in the national conscience. A quiet reminder that revolutions built on fear eventually fall beneath their own weight. Years later, when her bones were pulled from the pit and laid with ceremony in the royal necropolis of Saint Denis, a strange restoration occurred, not of monarchy, but of truth. Her name was spoken again with the gravity of a human life, rather than the venom of propaganda. And she was mourned not as a sovereign, but as a woman who faced death with more composure than the world ever granted her in life. It became clear that history does not preserve power. It preserves the way people stand in the face of hopelessness. Marie Antoinette left this world stripped of her children, her crown, her voice, and her identity. Yet she carried into death the one thing: no tribunal, no crowd. No blade could take the unbroken stillness of someone who refused to die as the monster they demanded she become. And that stillness, that soft whispered apology to the executioner, that final lift of her head as the drums silenced and the blade rose, is why her story continues long after the shouts of the revolution have faded. She remains not as the villain her enemies painted, but as the enduring question that outlived them all: where does justice end? And where does cruelty begin when a nation convinces itself the two are the same?